Baobab Redwood. Welcome to Baobab Redwood and Neem, a peace vigil interview series which seeks to inspire hope and action for peace. Peace Vigil works on peace education. Today, our co-director Sameer Dossani will be talking to Professor Prabhat Patnaik, who is a retired professor of economics, formerly with the Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU in Delhi. Professor Patnaik is considered one of the foremost scholars of economic theory in the world. We requested him to share his thoughts on the economics behind the rise of what he calls Neo-Fascism. If you like this interview, remember to like and subscribe.
Professor Prabhat Patnaik, it's a pleasure to have you on Baobab Redwood and Neem.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I wanted to ask you a question, sir, just starting from the beginning, because when we look at the origin of, we had discussions with Professor Harbans Mukhia on this channel, where we've discussed the origins of this Hindu-Muslim violence as taking place during the colonial period. And I know you've done a lot of work about what was happening during the colonial period as well. And one of the sort of takeaways from one of your recent books that you wrote with your wife Utsa is that Britain stole the equivalent of trillions of pounds and never sort of gave that money back. So why is it important to look at that colonial history when we're talking about issues of peace and economics and so on?
Yes, our idea was not just to argue that Britain's relationship with India was just a bilateral one, that Britain stole this money. Yes, it did. But our idea was really to show that this money is what sustained the entire capitalist system. In other words, countries that did not, for instance, also have colonies of their own. From my student days, I've been asked, but look, you are arguing that imperialism is necessary for capitalism. But what about the Scandinavian countries? They didn't have empires. But you see, that misses the point in the following way. That basically what happened was that the British market was completely open to the goods being exported from all the European countries as well as from the United States. In other words, other countries, as it were riding piggyback. They didn't have to have colonies of their own. They actually had access to the British market, and Britain had access to the colonial market. Not only did it have access to the colonial market, but it also met its balance of payments problems by siphoning this enormous amount of funds, with which not only did it meet its current account deficit, but also made substantial capital exports. So our idea was really to show this drain from India as sustaining the entire capitalist system during the period of the Victorian and the Edwardian boom. So in that sense, it is not just a bilateral relationship, but a structural one required by world capitalism.
Yeah. So I just want to stop you there for half a second because I think we need to define some terms. So you say Britain had a balance of payments problem during the colonial era. What does that mean precisely?
Well, okay, what it means is that Britain had a deficit in terms of its trade and so on with the newly emerging countries of that time, which basically meant the United States, continental Europe. And that deficit was offset by Britain's having a surplus vis-a-vis the colonies. Now, the surplus, particularly India, was a very important part of this colonial world. Now, that surplus consisted of two things. One was, of course, the export of manufacturing textiles in particular. Eric Hobsbawm talks about Britain's, kind of flight to the colonies as far as her export markets are concerned. The other consisted of supposedly the export of services against which Britain was taking this money from countries like India that the nationalist writers called the drain. Now, the balance of payments, as you know, must always balance. There have to be two kinds of equivalent entries on both sides. So against the money that Britain was taking from India, the entry on the other side is that Britain was exporting things to India, which were in the sense of good administration or whatever, services of various kinds to India. So Britain concocted, as it were, an export surplus vis-a-vis the colonies in order to meet its deficit vis-a-vis the newly emerging countries of that time. If Britain had not done so, then the gold standard would have collapsed. The newly emerging countries would really have not been able to get the markets themselves and so on.
Fascinating. So the point is, there may be a few countries that didn't, that didn't have their own colonies, or maybe the colonies weren't a significant part of their economies. Like I think the Netherlands, maybe in the period we're talking about, Indonesia wasn't necessarily a massive part of trade for the Netherlands, but they were able to leverage their position in Europe to accelerate their own development by targeting Britain as a market for exports. And then Britain in turn was using different kinds of shenanigans. You guys document some fancy bookmaking to make it seem as if everything was balancing out, but in fact they were just siphoning wealth from India. Have I got the story more or less correct?
Yes, that's more or less correct. In fact, we have to see it as a trilateral relationship. Britain on one side, the newly industrializing countries of the world, but of the capitalist world, the United States and continental Europe on the other side, and the colonies on the third hand. So a trilateral, not just bilateral.
Right. And then that reminds me, in case our listeners forget that, the manufactured goods that Britain produced earlier than others was also still a key piece of this, especially when it comes to another triangle, which was the triangle of the transatlantic slave trade. And I imagine that some of those manufactured goods were also ending up in India as well.
Yes, the slave trade really reached its peak a bit earlier because, of the Victorian and the Edwardian boom, which is really mid-19th century right up to the First World War, which is sometimes referred to as a long boom of the long 20th century. The slave trade was really in the heyday of the slave trade, really predated this period. Now, what I would like to emphasize here is that, as a matter of fact, there is a story behind this trilateral I was telling you about. You see, basically, British goods had become increasingly uncompetitive vis-a-vis those of the newly industrializing countries, because the newly industrializing countries were actually having new machines and higher labor productivity and so on, sometimes referred to as the penalty of the early start. That the British machinery was more outdated, and therefore Britain was becoming less and less competitive. These less competitive goods, it actually sold in the colonial markets, where they displaced the traditional handloom weavers and so on, and created deindustrialization in the colonies, even while extracting substantial amounts of surplus against the fictitious payments, as fictitious payments against the service.
So this is the use of the colonies as a kind of captive market. Yeah, they don't have a choice. They have to buy what you give them.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, fascinating stuff, and I'm sure we could spend the whole hour on this topic. But I do want to fast forward. Let's fast forward for the sake of argument. Let's talk a little bit about 100 years ago. So roughly 100 years ago, you had a booming economy based largely in Europe and in the U.S. It eventually crashed in 1929. You had a big crash, and as a result of this crash, many people think, maybe including yourself, but you'll give us your own view. Eventually, fascism and Nazism and Japanese fascism and Italian fascism were able to come out of that. What, in your reading of history, is the connection between those two things, the economics of it and the rise of fascism in the classical sense 100 years ago?
You see, obviously, when capitalism is booming, then you find that liberal values, liberal capitalism, a liberal atmosphere is sustained. as a part of this boom. But when capitalism gets into a crisis, typically it turns to other ways of sustaining itself, and one of those ways is fascism. So I see fascism as coinciding or reflecting, if you like, a period of economic crisis in capitalism. Not economic crisis in a small sense, like, kind of 10-year cycles or 8-year cycles or something, but a period of protracted crisis. Now, I see the period of, let us say, from the First World War right until the end of the Second World War as one such protracted crisis for capitalism. I see the crisis somewhat differently, because basically the argument I was putting forward earlier, namely the role of the colonial markets had got more or less exhausted by the First World War. Because after all, how much of British exports can India take? Because of the limit to people's purchasing power and all the rest of it. So in that sense, the First World War really marks a certain end. It's a kind of climacteric for capitalism, where the First World War marks a certain end. Now, I see the crisis of the interwar period as really reflecting this, namely that Britain did not have, or capitalism did not have, the access to colonial markets, or even if it had access, it couldn't use them any further, while at the same time, the kind of markets that Keynes talked about later, namely the state coming in to provide demand for capitalist products, to the so-called demand management by the state, that came only after the Second World War. So really, this was a long period during which capitalism was without a prop, as it were, without a stimulus, without a kind of economic support. And in this period, obviously, you had the Great Depression, and in such a period, capitalism tends to turn to fascism as a way of sustaining itself.
Yeah, this in some ways this is a very interesting concept, and I'm not quite sure I understand it. So I guess in the period that you're talking about, well, let's step back before we get to fascism. There's this question about market saturation, right? So if I'm understanding correctly, what you're saying is that capitalism, in its very fundamental logic, relies on companies being able to expand profit and market share, but there's a problem that we have a world of finite resources and finite people, at least to some extent. And so the markets within Europe may have been saturated at that time. And then the question about whether markets or saturated without the kind of welfare state measures that only came in later, which would create a big middle class, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the question about is the colony also, is India also saturated in a similar sense, or can markets there expand? Have I put the problem correctly?
Well, let me put it this way. In the book, we argue that capitalism always requires an external market in order to set its boom going. Now, the external market is something which is not necessarily only geographically external. The state providing a market can also be an external market. External into the kind of, corpus of capitalism, which consists of workers and capitalists. Okay? So two such markets, and we'll come to it in explaining the contemporary crisis of capitalism, the contemporary emergence of neo-fascism, that colonial markets really played this role for a very long time. By that, I don't mean that capitalism only sells to the colonial markets, not at all. What it means is that in periods when there's a crisis, the access to the colonial markets gets the boom going. And of course, when the boom is going, a substantial amount of sales are done internally within the capitalist sector itself. So it's a kind of, it's a spark that really sets the system going. So colonial markets played that role. Whenever there was a crisis, exports to the colonial market particularly increased. Of course, there was always a certain amount of exports, and that in turn is what got the capitalist countries out of the crisis. As a matter of fact, there were no major crises between, let's say, the middle of the 19th century and the First World War. Now, that being the case, with the exhaustion of the colonial markets, capitalism loses that kind of access to an external stimulus. And that is why, when in the post-war period, immediately you have a kind of what is called an aftermath boom, because during the war years, a lot of demand gets built up, pent-up demand is not met. But the moment the aftermath boom collapses, first you have, of course, an agricultural crisis, then you have the Great Depression. So the crisis of capitalism begins in the late 1920s, and that is related to this phenomenon of the exhaustion of the colonial. And it is in that context that that fascism in that period played a kind of dual role. On the one hand, fascism actually got the capitalist countries where fascism triumphed out of this crisis through armaments expenditures. Japan was the first country to come out of the Great Depression, and that it did in 1931, the very first country. And that's exactly because the Japanese military fascism really expanded arms spending in preparation for the war. Similarly, Germany came out of the Depression in 1933. The liberal capitalist countries came out of the Depression only when they started arming themselves for the war in the late 1930s, when it became very clear that they are going to be under attack. So the point is that, fascism in that period played that kind of a role, and at the same time, it played the other role of providing a source of stability as far as capitalism was concerned, because of the fact that the workers were suppressed, the trade unions were suppressed, and so on. So demand came from the military side. On the other hand, the workers were suppressed, and therefore the capitalists made substantial profits, and they were, of course, in cahoots with the fascist forces. In fact, Mikhail Kalecki, the well-known economist, called fascism a partnership between the fascist upstarts and the big bourgeoisie. That's basically what fascism was.
Yeah, and if you read Mussolini's writings, I mean, he doesn't. That's his thinking as well. I mean, it's very clear.
Yes.
Yeah.
There is, by the way, some doubt about whether he actually wrote that or not.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's some doubt in that story. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're talking about the famous quote that whether fascism is
That's
the merger of corporatism and so on. But I'm talking about other letters that he wrote. Like, you can go and read this stuff.
nice.
Maybe that particular
Yeah,
line is not there, but the idea is very much
that
there.
particular line. Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. That's what they're thinking, their understanding.
Yeah, but I just want to clarify this again. So I mean, I guess what happens when you allow the fascists into power? So the fascists are allowed into power because they are arguing for a way of both revitalizing the economy through an investment in military spending, which would otherwise be unwarranted, right? And they are very fond of they present a way to control what might otherwise be an uncontrollable working class. But then the problem becomes, once they're in power, they don't want to leave. So you tell the story of the assassination of a Japanese minister. Maybe you can tell that story again,
That's right.
please.
Yes. You see, because the Japanese minister Takahashi, finance minister, who really engineered the boom when Japan had more or less come close to full employment and had reached de facto full employment, he said, okay, now we put a stop to it. But the Japanese military was not satisfied with that. Takahashi was looking at it as an economic problem, how to get rid of the unemployment of the Great Depression, while the Japanese military was actually interested in arming itself. And therefore, they didn't want to stop the armaments expenditures, so they got Takahashi assassinated.
And then eventually, the Japanese invaded what was then known as Manchuria.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Okay, this is all very fascinating. So if I can just sum up this part of the discussion, fascist forces, maybe they never go away. They're always fascist or forces in the society. But when they become dangerous is when they are seen by the bourgeoisie or by people with money as a potential tool to control society in certain ways and to maybe deal with this looming crisis, which is a structural crisis in capitalism, I think you would say, which is that eventually you run out of markets. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Okay, so let's forward again. Maybe let's not fast forward the next 50, 60 years completely. Let's talk a little bit about the system that Keynes helped to create, which I learned was called the Bretton Woods system, and I learned that it It involved the tie of everything to the US dollar and everything and the US dollar to gold, and that it was in place between 1948 and 1971, and that during that time, and even for a few decades maybe after that time until the 1990s, it brought some stability to this system. At least that's my understanding. Have I got it? Is that the picture you would paint as well?
Yes, that's sometimes referred to as the golden age of capitalism because you had, first of all, capitalist economies functioning with levels of unemployment, levels of employment, which had been historically unprecedented. I was a student in England in the late 1960s, and the unemployment rate was less than 2%, just about 2%, which was remarkably low. I remember one of my professors, Lord Balog, later on he became joined Harold Wilson's government. He was a Jewish emigre from Hungary. Uh, During the fascist period, I remember Lord Balog saying that if unemployment in Britain really goes above 500,000, in that case, you would have fascification of the British society. Of course, it went much beyond 500,000 later. But the link between unemployment and the growth of fascism was at that time clear to everybody. And one of the achievements of Keynesian demand management, so-called golden age of capitalism, is that unemployment was really down. In the United States, unemployment in the Kennedy years was as low as 4%, which is really very low by American standards. Now, while unemployment was low, you also had high rates of growth of GDP, high rates of growth of labor productivity, and because unemployment was low, the workers' bargaining strength was high, trade unions were very strong, therefore, also high rate of growth of wages together with labor productivity. Therefore, the conditions of the working class really improved quite dramatically in those 2.5 decades following the Second World War. Now, that, of course, that's why it's called the golden age of capitalism. But that came to an end because you see, capitalism cannot really function with such low levels of unemployment because of the fact that, as Marx had argued, it needs a substantial substantial reserve army of labor. It needs to break the bargaining strength of the workers. And for that, you need a certain proportion of the workforce that must be unemployed. And what Keynesian demand management had done was to assume that all unemployment was really because of demand, but because of a shortage of demand. As a matter of fact, there is a certain amount of unemployment that capitalism requires, and any breaching of that is something which is going to give rise to inflation, which is exactly what happened towards the end of the golden age. It came to an end because of this inflation, which really got out of hand. It began in the late 1960s, but by the 70s, it really was beginning to accelerate. And of course, at the same time, you had the emergence of finance capital, which was very keen on globalization. You asked about the Bretton Woods system. You see, throughout this period that we are talking about, throughout the golden age of capitalism, the United States was really, because the dollar, as you said quite rightly, was linked to gold, it was convertible for gold. The United States was nonetheless going on printing dollars order to make capital exports to Europe, where actually American companies used to buy up European companies on the basis of dollars which were printed in the United States and which were supposed to be as good as gold. And therefore, European banks just held them. Which is when de Gaulle revolted and of course insisted that, okay, if they are convertible to gold, we would like to change our dollars for gold, which is when the Bretton Woods system collapsed, because obviously they didn't have enough gold to really convert all the dollars. So that the end of the Bretton Woods system arose because of the fact that the US was printing dollars originally for capital exports, and subsequently it also started having a current account deficit. Originally, the US never had a current account deficit. It always had a surplus. But on the other hand, towards the later phases of the Bretton Woods arrangement, it also started having current account deficit. So there was an enormous, and for instance, to fight the Vietnam War, dollars from the US. So that those dollars were held in American and European banks, and they wanted to go global in investing those dollars. But on the other hand, the Bretton Woods system allowed countries to have capital controls, trade controls. And those had to go, and therefore the Bretton Woods system had to go under pressure from the newly emerging finance capital, which was international, which wanted to be globalized. It was not tied to a particular country. So the golden age came to an end because, on the one hand, its own contradictions led to substantial inflation. On the other hand, you had the emergence of a new actor that really took the lead in wanting to break this arrangement. Margaret Thatcher is a very good example. Margaret Thatcher created millions of unemployed in Britain in order to break inflation, in order to break the back of inflation. But on the other hand, the city of London, which is where the finance capital of Britain certainly and of much of the world is concentrated, loved Margaret Thatcher at that point. So she acted as the spokesperson of international finance capital to break the system by, getting rid of this whole business about high levels of employment and so on. I think she created some 3 million unemployed in Britain.
Yeah, in a country that at that time must have been about what I don't know what the population would have been, 30 or 40 million, something like this. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Well, the population was about 50 million.
50 million.
So the workforce may have been about 20 million. So
Yeah.
substantial.
No, huge, and there's a lot to talk about there with some of the policies. What's described as Thatcherism or the Washington Consensus, depending on who you talk to and so on. But before we get there, let me just sum up what I think you've said, which is basically that under the Bretton Woods system or under this so-called golden age of capitalism, there are structures in place which allow for rich people and governments as well to create surpluses. Mostly those surpluses would have been in dollars. And once the surpluses exist, that sort of creates a class of people who will hold surpluses, and then a very powerful class, because now you're talking about people who either have access to or ownership over a hell of a lot of money, right? Whether in gold or dollars or some combination of the two. And that class is what emerges during the Reagan-Thatcher era in demanding this sort of liberation of finance capital, in demanding the Washington Consensus the sort of banging on about free trade and even free currency at one point it was. No currency controls, although I think they've backed away from that a little bit. Have I got the story more or less correct?
Yes, yes. I think what you're saying is absolutely right. I mean, the point is that the Bretton Woods system, by giving dollar this privileged position, allowed the United States to really print dollars, because the US was in effect sitting on a gold mine. So they printed dollars, because of which eventually it was not sustainable, because it went in the hands of all kinds of financiers and banks and so on, who wanted to go and invest it. They didn't want to hold it as deposits, but they wanted to invest it. And that being the case, the arrangements of the Bretton Woods system that really allowed trade and capital controls came in the way.
Yeah. Okay, that's understood. But then we get to the next phase, which we can describe as the bubble phase. And so my question is, if the investors did all this, they changed all this policy, they have all this power, why did they do such a bad job with their investing? Wherever they seem to put their money, there seems to be a crash a few years later. What's going on there?
No, you see, immediately what happens is, therefore, the neoliberal regime comes into being. In the place of the Bretton Woods regime, in the place of state intervention in demand management, you have the emergence of a neoliberal regime. which basically means that commodities and capital, including finance, are really free to move globally. Now, the neoliberal regime also, you see, the crucial thing about a neoliberal regime is that capital is international. Finance is international, but the state remains a nation state. And therefore, if you have a nation state confronting international capital, then it must be the case that the state has to kowtow to this international capital, because otherwise this capital would just go out of the country. You would have capital flight and therefore a financial crisis. Therefore, it really gives an upper hand to globalized capital vis-a-vis the nation state. And one implication of that is that Keynesian demand management is something which really goes out of the window, because finance always has insisted on, even in Keynes' own lifetime, on controlling the fiscal deficits. See, because Keynesian demand management implies that the state can enlarge the level of aggregate demand. The state can do so only if its expenditure is financed either by a fiscal deficit, then you're not taxing anybody. You're just kind of not taxing anybody, or if it is financed by taxing the rich, because they save a part of their income, and therefore if $100 you take from them, 50 of it comes out of savings, and if you spend it, in that case there would be net increase in demand of 50. So, but both these become anathema under the neoliberal regime, because it doesn't want the rich to be taxed, and secondly, it doesn't like a fiscal deficit. And that being the case, you actually have Keynesian demand management going out of the window, and you, of course, have the state being completely crippled in any kind of welfare measures to be introduced as far as the people are concerned, because all these, the state is hamstrung by the fact that it is confronting globalized finance.
The state is hamstrung, but the state is also the only mechanism, the only governance mechanism that we have here, right? So I'm still, I mean, if I'm playing devil's advocate, yeah.
No, I should say the state is hamstrung only in acting in ways that would help the people, but therefore what it does is it actually helps the capitalists. I mean, the neoliberal state is one that's completely acting all the time in favor of the capitalists.
No, for sure. And when we're talking about the US or Britain, of course, that is very much the case. But when we're talking about a country like Zimbabwe, I get the feeling it's also the case, but for different reasons. I mean, Zimbabwe has to do with international investors want, because, look, it's already been punished by investors many times in the last 20 years,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely, which is why I think it's really impossible to have a welfare state in the third world unless you actually get out of this web of global financial flows.
Yeah, and that's a whole different discussion, because I think you and I, at one point, were quite eager to talk about alternative financing mechanisms and things like the BRICS Bank and so on that might have been able to break, but that has been disappointing. But let's not go down that thread. Instead, let's go back to this question of the bubbles. So for a while, you had a bubble that broke, and then you had the reinflation of another bubble. So when the bubble breaks, I guess this is just cyclical. This kind of cyclical capitalism that Keynes described, but maybe in a different forum, right? So you have a period of irrational exuberance, I think is the technical term, or the term that's often used. You have a lot of investing, and then you have the crash of the market. And we've seen this happen in my lifetime, which is less than your lifetime, of course, sir. I've seen it happen, .com, housing. Before that, I've seen the savings and loans crisis in the 1980s. So at least 3 times that I can remember, and these are massive, both accumulation and contraction of wealth. So what's going on with these bubbles bursting?
You see, let's just go back to what we began with, that I said that capitalism requires an external stimulus. The colonial markets did such a stimulus, and with Keynes's writings, state intervention provided such a stimulus. Now, in when we come to neoliberalism, I think the colonial markets don't play any significant role, and state intervention becomes impossible because of the fact that, as we just discussed, that finance is globalized and it puts pressure on the state not to have either taxing of the rich or a fiscal deficit through which the state could spend more. Now, that being the case, that capitalism under a neoliberal capitalism is a capitalism that is really without that kind of an external stimulus. The only way that neoliberal capitalism can experience growth is through bubbles. So you see that sometimes people say, why did the Fed? You see, when the dot-com bubble collapsed, the Fed chairman at that time was Alan Greenspan, who actually lowered interest rates to stimulate the housing bubble. Many people blame him, say, look, I mean, this man will be responsible, and that he actually kind of, deliberately stimulated a bubble, but the bubble we know would not last. Eventually, it will collapse, and with its collapse, there'll be recession and so on, as happened in 2008. But you see, had he not done so, in that case, you would have had a crisis even earlier. So that those who argue that the bubble should not be allowed to get formed miss the point that neoliberal capitalism cannot have growth unless there are bubbles of various kinds. Now, of course, a bubble cannot always be stimulated. A bubble cannot always be made to order. Now, what has actually happened now is that after the collapse of the housing bubble, you haven't had a bubble of that order of magnitude. There have been small bubbles all the time in India, in China, in the United States also, but nothing of that kind, which is why world capitalism has been stuck in a period of protracted crisis. Because you don't have colonial markets, you don't have state intervention, and you don't even have bubbles which can provide some kind of a relief from this.
Right, and to go back to the 1920s, your argument would be that in these kind of situations, capitalists may again turn to fascists, again for the reasons that we discussed before, which is that maybe we call them neo-fascists now because they're not necessarily fascists in the classical sense, but again they provide a mechanism of control, and they also potentially. I don't know that this is the case, but are fascists also arguing for increased armaments and so on? I don't even know.
No, that is the fundamental difference between classical fascism and neo-fascism, which is why I like the prefix neo. You see, that in classical fascism, there were, Japan, for instance, spent this military expenditure through which Japan got rid of its unemployment, came out of the depression. That expenditure government borrowing. That means by a fiscal deficit. And the point is, any opposition that Japanese finance capital may have had to this, or German finance capital may have had to German military expenditures, is something that was handled by the German state because of the fact that finance capital was national and the state was a nation state. But now the contradiction between a globalized finance and the nation state is as relevant under a fascist regime as it is under a liberal capitalist regime. And therefore, even fascists now are incapable of providing the kind of government expenditures that can actually get rid of unemployment. So the capacity of fascism to overcome the crisis that currently afflicts their respective economies is negligible. The repressive role remains, but not really the role of pulling economies out of the crisis.
Yeah, so I mean, it just begs the question about why capital would. I mean, what is the attraction of fascism in these circumstances? Because it's not deficit spending as you mentioned. So what is the attraction?
The attraction of fascism is that that it actually provides stability to capitalism. In other words, there might be there might be an upsurge against unemployment, against the kind of hardships that people are facing because of all this. But of course, fascism plays a dual role there. On the one hand, it's repressive, and on the other hand, fascism has an ideology. The ideology is manufacturing the other, which is supposed to be responsible for the hardships of the people. In India, it is the Muslims. Somewhere else, it is some ethnic minority. Somewhere else is the immigrants, and so on. So that, it's always projecting the other
Yeah.
as to the majority, and that has a very powerful ideological role.
Yeah, and certainly on our channel, there's lots of videos about the role of the other and this process of othering and so on. I mean,
Absolutely.
if I can just let me put it in my own words, and you'll tell me if you agree or disagree with what I'm saying. It sounds as though we use capitalism in a very loose sense. I mean, what I want to talk about is some kind of like an oligarchy that where the investor class is on top, some kind of a hierarchical system with the investor class calling all the shots, right? And in that system, we can call it neoliberalism just for shorthand, but it's really, that's what we're describing. And in that circumstance, when the financial investor class sides with neo-fascists, it is a kind of a desperate attempt to make sure that the social order remains as it is. Because the alternative is some kind of socialism, some kind of whatever you want to call it, communism or whatever, some more equitable share, these piles of resources that are basically not being put to productive use. They actually should get circled back into the society. And through, I mean, some of us have proposed very modest things like a Tobin tax and so on. This would just be a small, trickle almost in terms of the amount of money that the investor class controls. But even that is opposed by these folks. And when they oppose those small reformist measures, they make the more radical revolutionary measures the only solution. And in that circumstance, that's when you need the whoever it is, the Narendra Modis, the Bolsonaros of the world, and so on, to point fingers and distract people so that people can't organize and overthrow that system.
Absolutely. I mean, this neo-fascism is growing. I mean, Italian elections yesterday, Swedish elections a few days ago. It's growing, so that this neo-fascism is actually now a global phenomenon, not only confined to a few third world countries, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, India, Brazil, and so on, but is now actually, in a very serious way, confronting Europe.
Yeah, so this is all is all very it's a very prescient picture, and it's a very what's the word? It's a very astute picture I think you paint, but it's also in some ways a very depressing picture. So as we move to the end of the conversation, let's talk about what are the alternatives. So when I was young or when you were young, we were basically told that work with your trade unions, build up the local infrastructure, and so on. This is how movements happen, and this is how change happens. But given these driving forces, I mean, is that still the advice to the younger generation, or what do we have to do to really change the system?
There is one point which I want to bring to your notice. See that when this happens, when you have the ascendancy of fascism, but the current ascendancy of, in 1930s, the because of the unemployment, you had simultaneously the growth of fascism on the one hand, as well as the growth of communism on the other hand. I mean, both Italy and Germany. In Germany, I believe the membership of the German Communist Party increased greatly with unemployed youths joining it. So you had both ways. The growth of fascism was really accompanied by a growth of the left, of resistance, of communism, and so on. Now, what you find in the growth of fascism is not accompanied by any such growth of the left. And I think part of the reason is because the left also, at least over large parts of the world, certainly in Europe, has got hegemonized by the neoliberal ideology. I think you drew a very important distinction earlier that neoliberalism is a regime, is the economic regime of relatively free capital and commodity flows. But the people at the head of it are what I would call a corporate financial oligarchy, because the corporate world and the financial world are very closely intermingled. And therefore, I would call it a corporate financial oligarchy. So the corporate financial oligarchy sits on top of this neoliberal regime. And unfortunately, even in large segments of the left, there is no kind of conception of a beyond. to this. And I think that is something which actually makes the appeal of the left much weaker as far as anti-fascist struggles are concerned. I think we have to really break out of this. I think we have to put before the people a clear agenda of material improvement. Because, say, in India, now Narendra Modi is not talking about people becoming materially better off. He's talking about Hindus becoming, suppressing the Muslims. But on the other hand, if we could present both before the Hindus and Muslims an alternative world in which they would both be better off and equal citizens and so on, that would really overcome the Modi kind of appeal. And for that, we have to go beyond the neoliberal regime, which has brought all this unemployment and kept people submerged in this long drawn out crisis. And I think for the left to do that, it's important for it not to be hegemonized by neoliberal capitalism.
Yeah, in other words, the things that we saw as I'm using to refer to the left sort of in very, very broad terms, the things that, we opposed, 30, 40 years ago, which was the privatization, the liberalization, and so on, but people don't seem to be opposing it anymore. It just seems to be taken for granted that this is the world that we have to negotiate. So capital controls could be on the, should be talked about. Currency controls and also trade controls and so on, and renationalization as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. And a wealth tax, because there's been enormous increase in wealth inequality, a wealth tax to finance welfare state expenditures. So I think these are things, and mind you, the London Economist has articles saying that, yes, these things have to come back.
Yeah, because from their point of view, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you're a sensible capitalist at this point in time, you see the contradictions in the system, and you see where's it going to go? It's only going to get worse, right? So there actually has to be some compromise with these quote unquote leftist principles. The problem is there aren't many sensible capitalists out there. At least they don't seem to have any power.
Exactly. I mean, capitalism is not a planned system, so.
But you can see when you can read about the wealth tax in The Economist or whatever it is, it shows you that smart people understand that there are contradictions in the system, and without some slow reform, you're going to head towards some kind of a wall. And then if there's another crisis that doesn't happen in the context of, it happens in a heavily armed world, in a world in increasingly, armed conflicts between powerful states and so on, things in nuclear armed states and so on, things could get really bad really quickly. So I don't think any of us, even the most capitalist of us, wants that kind of outcome. So maybe that's why they're thinking along these lines as well. Yeah. Prabhat Patnaik, it's been a pleasure. Any other closing comments you want to leave us with?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I hope I have really made myself clear.
No, it's been a fantastic conversation. And I look forward to having you give this kind of lecture back here in South Africa whenever you're traveling again.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
You were listening to Baobab, Redwood and Neem, an interview series by Peace Vigil, which seeks to inspire hope and action for peace. Our guest today was Professor Prabhat Patnaik, and our co-director Sameer Dossani was talking to him. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.